There's something unsettling about watching a legend slow down. Not fall, not fail. Just slow. And that's where Sir Rod Stewart is now. 81 years old. Over 120 million records sold. Knighted by the Queen in 2016. Two-time inductee into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. From the outside, that looks like victory. But here's the part nobody likes to say out loud. What happens when you achieve everything and you're still here, still touring, still proving, still trying to outrun time? In May 2025, Rod stood on stage at the American Music Awards. 5 of his children surprised him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. He performed Forever Young. And for a moment, just a moment, he looked emotional. Not the cocky frontman from the 70s. Not the blonde rebel swinging the mic stand. A father. An 80-year-old man singing a song he first released in 1988. The audience cheered. Of course they did. But something was different. Because just weeks later, in June 2025, he canceled multiple U.S. tour dates. Flu, his team said. Exhaustion. Doctors told him to rest. He wrote that he was devastated. That word matters. Devastated. Not annoyed. Not inconvenienced. Devastated. That's not the reaction of a man going through the motions. That's a man who still believes the stage is oxygen. And here's where the story shifts. Rod Stewart was never supposed to be the clean-cut icon. He was born January 10, 1945, in Highgate, London. Working-class family. Football obsession. Wanted to go pro before music ever took over. The voice, that raspy, shredded silk voice, it wasn't polished. It was lived in, weathered before fame even arrived. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Faces, Maggie May, sold-out arenas, Rod became the image of rock swagger. Tight pants, wild hair, models on his arm, champagne nights. He wasn't subtle. He didn't pretend to be deep. But over time, something shifted. Because fame that loud comes with a cost. Divorces, headlines, financial battles, public criticism in the 80s when disco crept in and rock purists turned on him. He adapted. He always adapts. That's one of Rod's real strengths. But adapting also means shedding versions of yourself. And when you live 60 years in the spotlight, how many skins can you peel before you don't quite recognize what's underneath? He battled thyroid cancer in 2000, had surgery that threatened his voice, the thing that built everything. Later, prostate cancer. He kept that private for years before revealing it in 2019 to encourage other men to get tested. That's not performative activism. That's survival. And maybe that's the heart of this entire story. Rod Stewart has survived everything. Trends, critics, health scares, changing eras, aging in an industry that worships youth. But survival is different from peace. You see it in interviews now. He laughs. Still sharp. Still charming. But sometimes there's a pause. A half-second where he looks reflective. Like he knows the math. He has 8 children. A long marriage to Penny Lancaster since 2007. Grandchildren now. A legacy that will outlive him. So why keep pushing? Why tour at 80? Why risk illness for applause? Because here's the truth. Most legends never admit. The stage doesn't just give love. It replaces something. Rod once said performing feels like a football crowd cheering again. That rush never leaves. For some men, retirement feels like erasure. And maybe that's the quiet tragedy here. Not scandal, not collapse, but the slow realization that one day the curtain will close. Not because you chose to, but because your body decided. In 2025, doctors told him to slow down. He listened, briefly, then scheduled more dates. That's not stubbornness. That's identity. And when a man's identity has been welded to stadium lights since 1971, stepping away isn't rest. It's disappearance. And that, for someone like Rod Stewart, might be the most heartbreaking thought of all. If this opening surprised you, wait. Because the deeper cost of fame didn't start at 80. It started decades ago. There's a specific kind of fame that doesn't build slowly. It explodes. For Rod Stewart, that explosion came in 1971. Maggie May. A song almost left off the album. Radio stations at first didn't even treat it as the main track. It was a B-side in the UK. That's the part people forget. It wasn't designed to be the anthem of a generation. It just became one. By October 1971, it was #1 in both the UK and the United States. Same week. That's rare even now. Back then, almost unheard of. Rod was 26. Working-class London kid, now suddenly global. And that's when something dangerous happened. He realized he could win. Not just survive. Not just hang around great musicians like he had with the Faces. Win. Sell more. Pack bigger arenas. Live louder. Success didn't creep in. It flooded the room. The Faces were already making noise. Raw, loose, chaotic rock. But once Rod's solo career caught fire, tensions started building. Success shifts gravity. Bandmates notice. Egos flare. He was becoming something bigger than the group. And big things cast long shadows. By the mid-1970s, Rod Stewart wasn't just famous. He was unavoidable. Blonde spikes. Leopard print. Mic stand twirling like it weighed nothing. Women screaming. Tabloids circling. He dated models. Actresses. His lifestyle was loud enough to headline magazines even on weeks without new music. Some loved him for it. Others rolled their eyes. Critics started whispering that he was becoming more celebrity than artist. And here's where it gets interesting. Rod didn't retreat. He doubled down. When punk rock rose in the late 1970s and mocked glam excess, Rod pivoted toward pop. Then, disco. "Ya Think I'm Sexy?" In 1978, it hit #1, but rock purists hated it. They said he'd sold out. He shrugged and cashed the checks. That move alone made him one of the most adaptable figures in music history, and one of the most polarizing. Because every time he reinvented himself, a piece of the old Rod seemed to disappear. But reinvention has a cost. By the 1980s, the arena shows were massive. Wembley Stadium, 1986, over 90,000 people. American tours pulling in millions. Money wasn't a problem anymore. Privacy was. The image of the playboy became permanent. Divorces played out publicly. Relationships dissected weekly in British tabloids. And when fame reaches that level, something else happens quietly. You stop trusting rooms. When everyone wants something, a photo, a favor, a story, you learn to filter. Rod has spoken before about how isolating superstardom can become, not dramatically, just matter of fact. "You learn who's real," he once said in an interview. Short sentence, heavy meaning. The 1980s also brought something else. Distance from London. He moved to the United States. Tax reasons, yes. Lifestyle, yes. But when you leave home at that scale, home changes without you. And that's a quiet grief many rock legends carry. Because while he was building global empire, time was still moving back where he started. Parents aging. Old neighborhoods shifting. Faces disappearing. Fame suspends you in a bubble. Everyone else keeps aging normally. And here's the thing about unstoppable momentum. It doesn't ask if you're emotionally ready. By 1990, Rod Stewart was one of the most commercially successful artists alive. Inductions, awards, hit compilations, but something inside the machine was slowing. The music industry was changing again. Grunge arrived. Nirvana. Pearl Jam. The slick 1980s stadium rock era began fading. Suddenly, Rod wasn't the center of youth culture anymore. He was a legend. And that word sounds respectful. But for artists, it's complicated. Legend can mean respected. It can also mean finished. So he reinvented again. The American Songbook albums in the early 2000s, standards, Frank Sinatra-style classics. That project alone sold millions worldwide. People called it safe. But safe doesn't sell that much unless people are ready for you in a new role. Rod wasn't chasing the charts at that point. He was chasing longevity. And longevity requires something ego doesn't love: humility. But here's what most viewers your age will understand. Success in your 20s feels invincible. Success in your 40s feels earned. Success in your 60s and 70s? It feels fragile. And that's where the tragedy slowly begins. Because when your identity was built on being the wild one, the loud one, what happens when your body says, enough? That tension didn't start at 80. It started the moment he realized the industry was moving on without asking him. And next, we go to the moment everything almost stopped completely. There's a fear every singer carries. Not losing fame, not losing money, losing the voice. For Rod Stewart, that fear became real in 2000. He was 55, still touring, still active, not slowing down yet. Then doctors found thyroid cancer. Let that sit for a second. Thyroid cancer. For an accountant, that's terrifying. For a singer whose entire identity is tied to vocal grit, it's existential. Surgery was necessary. There was no debate. But surgery near vocal cords is delicate. Precision work. One slip, one complication, and the tone that defined decades could vanish. Rod later admitted he was afraid to even speak after the operation. Imagine that. A man who had filled Wembley Stadium, who had sung to millions, sitting in silence, unsure if the most recognizable rasp in rock would ever return. Doctors removed the tumor successfully. He survived. But recovery was brutal. He had to retrain his voice almost from scratch. Simple scales, basic vocal exercises, weakness where power used to live, no stage lights, no arena echo covering imperfections, just vulnerability. There's something humbling about starting over at 55. Most people at that age are protecting what they've built. He was rebuilding the foundation. And here's what people often miss about artists your age still performing. They're not doing it because they need to. They're doing it because stopping feels like disappearing. Rod has said in interviews that there were days he wondered if it was over. Not publicly dramatic about it, just honest. He came back slowly. 2001 performances. Cautious. Measured. Fans noticed something slightly different in the tone. Less raw edge, more control. And maybe that was maturity. Maybe it was caution. But he was alive. And then, just when life seemed steady again, another blow. In 2016, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. This time, he didn't tell the public immediately. He kept it private, only revealed it in 2019 during a fundraising event, encouraging men to get tested early. He said, "No one knows this, but I thought this was about time to tell everybody." There was no spectacle in the announcement, no press circus, just a man, already past 70, admitting he had quietly fought something terrifying. He survived that too. But survival leaves marks. It changes the way you walk into a room. It changes how you look at your children, how you look at the calendar. When you're young, time feels wide. At 26, you think in decades. At 75, You think in seasons, and that's when performing takes on a different meaning. It's not about proving anything anymore, it's about not wasting what's left. In interviews after his prostate cancer revelation, Rod talked more openly about health, about aging, about appreciating each show. That's not the swaggering 1975 Rod. That's a man who knows fragility personally. And here's where it gets quiet. After cancer, applause sounds different. It's not validation. It's gratitude. But there's also pressure. Because fans don't come to see vulnerability. They come to see energy. Youth preserved. The illusion that legends don't age. And Rod has spent years maintaining that illusion. Dyed hair, tailored suits, athletic frame, football references to prove he's still fit. He even joined soccer matches in his 70s. He doesn't want to be seen as fading. And maybe that's understandable. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every tour after cancer isn't just a performance. It's a risk. Fatigue hits harder. Recovery takes longer. Illness lingers. Which brings us back to 2025. At 80, when he had to cancel shows because of illness, the word he used was devastated. That wasn't about ticket refunds, it was about interruption. Because when you've survived cancer twice, you understand how quickly interruption can become something permanent. A flu is minor to most people. To someone who has faced mortality twice, it whispers something else. Slow down. And slowing down has always been his enemy. The voice came back, the tours continued, the awards stacked higher. But something fundamental shifted after cancer. He knew he wasn't invincible, and yet he kept pushing. Because stepping back feels too close to goodbye. And the next chapter? It's about the part fans rarely analyze. The marriages, the children, the emotional cost of loving a man who belonged to millions. There's a version of Rod Stewart most people remember first. The hair, the swagger, the women. In the 1970s and 80s, he wasn't just a rock star, he was a headline machine. Dating models, actresses, supermodels before that word even felt ordinary. From the outside it looked glamorous, effortless, almost cartoonishly successful. But here's something people your age understand better than younger viewers do. Charm is easy. Stability is hard. Rod's first high-profile marriage was to Alana Hamilton in 1979. It ended in 1984. Then came Rachel Hunter in 1990. She was 21. He was 45. That age gap made headlines even then. They looked like a golden couple through the 90s. Kids, magazine covers, big houses, big life. But in 1999, they separated. He once admitted later that he hadn't always been present. And that sentence carries weight. Because being present isn't about money, it's about time. He has 8 children. 8. Different eras of his life. Different mothers. Different chapters. That kind of family tree isn't chaotic by default, but it requires something difficult. Consistency. And rock stardom rarely runs on consistency. Tour schedules stretch months. Time zones blur. Fame invites temptation constantly. Even if you're disciplined, the environment isn't. Rod never pretended to be a saint. He's been candid about past infidelities. He's joked about excess. But behind jokes, there are real households adjusting to absence. One of the quiet tragedies of long-term fame is this. You become everyone's favorite memory, except the people at home. And that's not accusation. That's physics. Energy spent in stadiums is energy not spent at dinner tables. By the early 2000s, something shifted. He married Penny Lancaster in 2007. And this marriage lasted. Still lasting. That alone says something. He was in his 60s by then. No longer the chaotic frontman in his 20s. more reflective, calmer. Penny has spoken about his vulnerability, his health scares, his fears after cancer. That's a different Rod Stewart. Less performance, more human. But here's the subtle tension. When you've been Rod Stewart for 50 years, how easy is it to just be Rod? To walk into your living room without the weight of expectation? To age naturally without feeling watched? His children surprised him at the 2025 American Music Awards. 5 of them on stage. He looked emotional, proud, a bit stunned, and that moment hit differently than any sold-out show. Because applause from strangers is loud. Applause from your children? That's personal. And yet, even with family stability now, the years behind him can't be rewritten. Children from earlier marriages grew up with headlines attached to their father's name. They didn't choose that. They inherited it. Fame protects and exposes at the same time. Private arguments become public narratives. Divorce settlements become tabloid charts. And imagine being 10 years old seeing your family discussed by strangers weekly. That's part of the cost, too. Rod has rarely gone deeply emotional in interviews about fatherhood. He's affectionate, yes. Proud, yes. But there's also a protective layer, because admitting regret publicly means making it permanent. And at 81, regret carries weight, not scandal weight, personal weight. When you look at your grown children and realize how many birthdays you missed while chasing another encore. When you think about how many times a hotel suite replaced a bedtime story. He once said football was his first love before music. But music became the obsession that shaped everything. And obsession builds empire. It also narrows focus. Here's the uncomfortable thought. Maybe the tragedy isn't that he kept touring at 80. Maybe it's that the stage was always easier than staying still. Because on stage, the rules are clear. Sing well. Move well. Crowd roars. At home, love is slower. Messier. Less scripted. And slowing down now means facing time without noise. Which brings us to something even more complex. His legacy is secure. His family is large. His awards are permanent. But identity tied to applause, doesn't retire quietly. And in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the moment the industry quietly tried to move past him. Not cancel him. Not disgrace him. Just move on. There's a moment every long-running artist faces. It doesn't come with a press release. It doesn't come with a scandal. It comes quietly. The charts change. The radio changes. The audience gets younger. And suddenly, you're not the center anymore. For Rod Stewart, that shift started in the early 1990s. He was still famous, still selling tickets, still wealthy beyond imagination. But music had tilted. Grunge took over in 1991. Raw, anti-glamour, torn jeans and distortion. Nirvana wasn't interested in polished showmen. Neither was Pearl Jam. The wild hair, the leopard prints, the disco flirtations of the 80s, that era suddenly looked old. Rod wasn't old yet, but the spotlight had moved. And that kind of shift messes with you in ways people outside entertainment rarely understand. It's not about money. It's about relevance. Relevance is oxygen for performers. When your name stops being part of the cultural conversation, even if you're still touring, something tightens inside. He could have tried to chase the new sound. Some artists did. He didn't. Instead, he waited. And then, unexpectedly, he pivoted in the early 2000s to something almost nobody predicted. The Great American Songbook albums. Standards, Sinatra territory, Cole Porter, old classics. Safe? Maybe. Strategic? Definitely. Between 2002 and 2010, those albums sold millions. Millions. At an age when most rock singers quietly fade, Rod walked into Las Vegas-style elegance and found a new audience. Older fans who wanted nostalgia. Younger listeners discovering old standards for the first time. It worked. But here's what's subtle. That move wasn't rebellion. It wasn't youthful aggression. It was acceptance. Acceptance that he wasn't competing with 25-year-olds anymore. Acceptance that legacy sells differently than rebellion. And here's the complicated part. For men in their 40s and 50s watching this back then, the shift made sense. For younger critics, it looked like retreat. Rod didn't respond to critics much during that time. He didn't try to argue relevance. He just kept performing. Residencies, special tours, international shows. Steady. But steady isn't the same as center stage. There's a difference between being legendary and being current. One feels secure, the other feels alive. And if you've built your entire adulthood on being alive in the public eye, legendary can feel like polite applause at a retirement dinner. Rod never officially retired. He just adjusted the battlefield. Las Vegas residency in the 2010s. Huge money. Controlled environment. Familiar crowd. Vegas isn't about discovery. It's about durability. And durability doesn't trend. It survives. You see, the tragedy here isn't a dramatic downfall. It's the slow drift from headline to heritage. From "what's he doing next?" to "remember when." And even though he kept winning, ticket sales, honors, knighthood in 2016, cultural gravity had shifted. When he was knighted by Prince William in 2016, it was a proud moment. Sir Rod Stewart. Recognition at the highest level. But knighthood is also symbolic of something. You've completed something. You're now part of history. And history is glorious. But history doesn't chase new waves. So what does a man like that do? He tours harder. He stays visible. He refuses to be placed in the former category. Because once you accept former, momentum dissolves. And here's something real for your audience. At 60, 70, 80, you don't fight to be cool. You fight to not be forgotten. That's different. Rod has said he wants to keep performing as long as possible. He once joked he'd sing until they carry him off. That humor lands differently at 81 because the industry may move on. But the body keeps score. And when illness forced cancellations in 2025, even temporarily, it wasn't just a scheduling issue. It felt like proof. Proof that time doesn't negotiate. The industry may not have rejected him, but it doesn't wait for anyone either. And that quiet realization that you are no longer competing, you are enduring, is heavier than any bad review. But here's where things get sharper. Because the biggest criticism Rod faces now isn't about music. It's about lifestyle. And that's next. Let's talk about the part people whisper about. Not the music, not the awards, the lifestyle. For decades, Rod Stewart wasn't just known for his voice, he was known for excess. The 70s rock scene wasn't subtle. Backstage parties, champagne flowing, tabloids documenting who left with whom. Rod didn't deny it. He leaned into it. In 1989, he even made headlines for allegedly having one of the largest rock star spending habits of his era. Multiple mansions, luxury cars, European estates, American estates. He liked beautiful things and beautiful women. The tabloids loved that about him. But here's the part that lingers at 81. Youthful excess looks rebellious. Aging excess looks different. As the years passed, critics began pointing out contradictions. The Playboy image didn't shrink. It aged with him. And aging changes perception. When Rod dated younger women in his 40s and 50s, it was seen as classic rock behavior. By the time he was in his 70s and still maintaining that larger-than-life persona, some people began asking quieter questions. Is it confidence? Or is it fear of aging? That's not accusation, it's curiosity. Because image preservation takes effort. The dyed hair, the tailored suits, the physical fitness, the on-stage energy. He doesn't look like someone surrendering to time. He looks like someone negotiating with it. There's discipline in that, but also pressure. The truth is, when you've been photographed every year since 1971, aging isn't private. Every wrinkle is commentary. Every missed high note becomes a headline. And so some legends withdraw. They go quiet. Rare interviews. Minimal tours. Rod didn't. He stayed visible, which means he stayed judged. And here's something your audience understands. The older you get, the smaller the margin for mistakes. A 28-year-old rock star partying is wild. An 80-year-old doing anything excessive becomes debated. In 2020, during the pandemic, Rod was caught on camera breaking minor restrictions at one point in the UK. It sparked criticism online. Not scandalous, but symbolic. People started viewing him less as untouchable legend and more as a public figure subject to modern scrutiny. The world had changed, and so had cultural tolerance. Rock star immunity doesn't translate cleanly into social media era morality. Everything is documented now, permanent, and that creates friction for artists from a different time. Rod grew up in an era where rock was rebellion. Today's audience analyzes everything through accountability lenses, and navigating that while being 80? That's complex. He's never been linked to major scandals of misconduct or criminal controversy. That matters. But he's carried the weight of being labeled extravagant, privileged, sometimes out of touch. And here's what makes that interesting. Rod Stewart came from working-class London. Highgate. Football dreams. Modest beginnings. The wealth wasn't inherited. It was built. So when he enjoys it, openly, part of him may still feel like that 20-year-old who made it out. But the public doesn't always see that nuance. They see yachts, mansions, headlines, and forget the busking years. That disconnect grows with time. And as he aged, his public image hardened into two versions at once. To loyal fans, a survivor. A hard-working legend who kept performing despite cancer. To critics, an aging rock star still clinging to excess. Two narratives. Same man. At 81, neither version fully captures him. Because there's another layer beneath both. Fatigue. Not physical fatigue necessarily. Identity fatigue. When you've lived loudly for 6 decades, the noise follows you even into quiet rooms. The tragedy isn't that he enjoyed success. It's that success became inseparable from spectacle. And spectacle requires maintenance, which is exhausting. And here's the deeper tension. Rod Stewart never wanted to be boring, but aging gracefully sometimes means becoming quieter, less visible, less controversial. And that might be the hardest adjustment of all. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about something far more uncomfortable. The perception gap between how the world sees him now and how he may see himself. Here's the uncomfortable question. How does Rod Stewart see himself now? Not how we see him. Not the press. Not the fans. Him. Because there's often a gap. A wide one. You watch interviews from the 1970s. He's electric, quick, slightly cocky, laughing at reporters, talking about football and girls like the world, is one long Saturday night. Then you watch interviews from the 2020s. Still charming, still funny, but slower. There's more thought between sentences. He listens longer before answering. That's not weakness. That's mileage. At 81, you don't speak the same way you did at 26. And here's where perception gets tricky. The public sees the preserved image, the hair, the suits, the on-stage grin, and assumes he feels as invincible as he looks. But time doesn't negotiate with anyone. In 2023, during press interviews, Rod admitted touring is physically harder now. He didn't dramatize it. He just said it plainly. Recovery takes longer. Sleep matters more. Small illnesses linger. And when he canceled shows in 2025 due to flu complications, some fans reacted with understanding. Others reacted with impatience. That's the reality of being a legend. People forget the human timeline behind the icon. They remember the 35-year-old version frozen in album covers, not the 81-year-old man waking up stiff. And imagine that pressure, to match your younger self every night, to sing Maggie May at 81, while fans compare it in their heads to the 1971 recording. That comparison never stops. He may smile through it. But internally, it's a different experience. Rod once said he doesn't like looking back too much, that he prefers forward motion. That makes sense, because nostalgia is flattering, but it can also be suffocating. When your best years are constantly replayed on YouTube, when highlight reels from the 70s circulate every time you make a public appearance, it creates a silent competition with your own history. And here's something many men your age quietly recognize. Aging isn't the problem. Feeling watched while aging is. Rod doesn't get to age privately. When he dyes his hair, it's discussed. When he doesn't, it would also be discussed. When he cancels, it's headline news. When he pushes through illness, it's commentary about stamina. There's no neutral zone, and perception shifts with culture. What was once admired as stamina is now sometimes framed as denial. Some critics quietly question whether he should retire. Fans say, "Never stop." That's a contradiction no one can solve for him. Because retirement for a rock star isn't just financial, it's existential. When your identity has been applause since 1971, stepping away means confronting quiet. And quiet reveals things noise can hide. There's also the matter of legacy management. At 81, he knows the window is narrowing. Not dramatically, just realistically. That awareness creeps into decisions. What songs stay in the set list? What tours to accept? What interviews to give? You start thinking about the last version people will remember. Will it be the unstoppable performer? Or the tired veteran? That's harsh, but it's real. And that's where tragedy becomes subtle. Not collapse, not scandal. Just the tension between who you were and who you are becoming. Rod Stewart isn't a fallen icon. He's a man trying to control the final chapters of a story that began in black and white London streets. And controlling an ending is harder than controlling a beginning. Because beginnings are ambition. Endings are acceptance. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about something even deeper. What happens when the applause fades? Not permanently, but in smaller doses. There's a difference between silence and softening. For most of his life, when Rod Stewart walked on stage, the sound was instant, deafening. 70,000 people screaming before he even reached the microphone. In the 1970s and 80s, arenas shook. In 1994, he performed on Copacabana Beach in Rio to over 3 million people on New Year's Eve. That record still gets mentioned today. That kind of noise does something to your nervous system. It wires you to expect impact. But decades later, venues change. Not smaller in prestige, smaller in scale. Vegas residencies, theaters, carefully curated festival legends slots. The applause is still there, but it's different. It's not hysteria anymore. It's reverence. And reverence feels older. There's pride in it. Of course there is. But there's also finality built into that tone. When fans clap for a legend, they're applauding memory as much as performance. They're saying thank you, not discover me. And that shift matters, because at 81, Rod isn't introducing himself to a generation. He's maintaining connection with the one that grew up with him. And that generation is aging too. Look at the crowd at his recent shows. Silver hair in the first few rows. Couples who first danced to "Tonight's the Night" now holding hands more carefully. That's beautiful. But it's also sobering. Because the applause that once sounded like adrenaline now sounds like gratitude. And gratitude carries a different emotional weight. When Rod performed "Forever Young" at the 2025 American Music Awards, surrounded by his children, it wasn't about chart dominance. It was about endurance. And endurance is quiet power. But here's the ache underneath it. Adrenaline fades faster now. Recovery takes longer. And the crowd goes home. At 30, you go out after the show. At 81, you go back to the hotel room. Maybe ice something. Maybe take medication. That's not weakness. That's time. There's a clip from a recent European performance where Rod pauses between songs, just a few seconds longer than usual. He looks out at the audience, and you can't tell if he's soaking it in or measuring it. Because when you've stood in front of millions, you start noticing differences. Not because you're ungrateful, because you've experienced extremes. 3 million on a beach, 70,000 in Wembley, then 20,000 in a festival slot, then 6,000 in a residency hall. Still incredible, still successful, but scaled. And scaling feels like a countdown, even when it isn't. The hardest part about applause softening isn't ego. It's realization. Realization that you are no longer the phenomenon. You are the survivor. And surviving earns respect. But phenomena create chaos. Rod was once chaos in motion. Now he's a polished institution. And institutions don't explode. They sustain. There's something almost unfair about how success works. You spend your youth chasing explosion. You spend your later years preserving echo. And echo is quieter. Yet, he keeps going. Because as long as there is applause, any applause, identity remains intact. He once said he'd sing until he drops. It sounded playful. At 81, it sounds literal. And here's the deeper layer. When applause softens, introspection grows louder. There's more space between cheers. More time to think backstage. More awareness of the calendar. Rod's generation is shrinking. David Bowie, gone. George Michael, gone. Many Faces-era contemporaries, gone. Each loss narrows the circle. And when peers disappear, applause carries memory of those who aren't here to hear it. That changes its sound. It becomes less about triumph, more about tribute. And that is beautiful. But it's not the same rush as youth. In the next chapter, we need to address the final, unavoidable question. What happens when the body decides before the mind is ready? There's a moment in every aging performer's life that no one wants to talk about. Not publicly, not honestly. The moment when the body starts negotiating. For Rod Stewart, that negotiation isn't dramatic. It's incremental. He still sings, still tours, still fills venues, but the margin has narrowed. In June 2025, at 80 years old, Rod canceled multiple U.S. tour dates because of flu complications. He said he was devastated. That word again? Devastated. Most 80-year-olds cancel plans and shrug. It's life. But he doesn't see concerts as plans. He sees them as purpose. And when your purpose gets interrupted, even by something as small as the flu, it doesn't feel minor. It feels symbolic. Because at 30, the flu is annoyance, At 80, illness carries echoes. He has already faced thyroid cancer in 2000, prostate cancer in 2016. Twice reminded that mortality isn't abstract. So when the body weakens now, even temporarily, it's not just about recovery time. It's about awareness. There's a difference between feeling tired and feeling time. And the body starts whispering before it ever shouts. Longer warm-ups, more vocal rest, careful scheduling. You notice subtle adjustments. He moves less across the stage than he used to. Still energetic, yes, but measured. There's intention behind every step. You don't leap carelessly at 81. You calculate. And here's what's raw about that. His mind likely still wants the explosion. The run. The spin. The raw push of "stay with me," the way he did it in 1972. But joints age. Muscle memory adapts. And adrenaline doesn't override biology forever. That's not tragedy in the dramatic sense. It's tragedy in the inevitable sense. Because for a man whose identity is motion, slowing is disorienting. Rod once said in an interview that he feels younger inside than the number suggests. Most people over 60 say that. But the body eventually interrupts the illusion. When doctors advised him in 2025 to slow down, he listened. Briefly. Then resumed scheduling. That says something. It says he isn't done in his head. And that's the hardest crossroad of all. When your mind still burns, but your body begins setting terms. Fans don't always see the backstage version. Ice packs, vocal steamers, early nights, they see the spotlight version. But sustaining that spotlight requires negotiation. And negotiations intensify with age. You see it in how carefully he spaces tours now, how he protects certain performances. The Glastonbury Legends slot in 2025 wasn't random. It was symbolic. Legacy stage. Historical slot. Not chasing youth culture. Embracing longevity. Smart move. But even smart moves can't outrun the calendar. At 81, every year feels different. Because statistically, you become aware that every tour could be the last big one. That doesn't mean he's near collapse. It means perspective shifts. Rod isn't reckless. He works with doctors. He monitors his health. But the tension remains. You can protect stamina. You can't pause aging. And what makes this heavier is the psychological layer. The day he stops touring isn't just a health decision. It's an identity fracture. For 60 years, he's been introduced as on tour. Without that, what is he? Sir Rod Stewart? Retired singer? That phrase feels foreign. The body doesn't just threaten physical limitation. It threatens role removal. And role removal is frightening for anyone who built a life around performance. Here's the quiet truth. Legends don't fear dying on stage as much as they fear leaving it voluntarily. Because stepping off by choice feels like surrender. And Rod has never been wired for surrender. In the next chapter, we need to examine the final emotional tension, when success is complete, but satisfaction feels complicated. There's a strange thing about reaching the top. You expect calm, you expect satisfaction, you expect the hunger to finally quiet down. But for Rod Stewart, hunger never completely left. Look at the resume. Over 120 million records sold. Knighted in 2016 by Prince William. Two-time inductee into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. A 6-decade career that most artists can't even imagine. By normal standards, that's not just success, that's dominance. So why keep going? Why schedule tours at 80? Why push through illness to return to stage lights? Here's the answer nobody writes in headlines. Winning becomes normal. The first #1 hit feels explosive. The 10th feels expected. The Lifetime Achievement Award feels deserved, but not transformative. He stood on stage at the 2025 American Music Awards, surrounded by his children, performing Forever Young. It was a full-circle moment, and yet you could sense something behind the smile. Not sadness, reflection. Because when your career has stretched from vinyl to streaming, you start to see patterns. Fame rises, fame dips, fame rebrands, and eventually fame stabilizes. But appetite doesn't always shrink with it. Rod has admitted in interviews that he doesn't like the word retirement. He pushes against it, almost instinctively. That says a lot, because retirement for most people is a reward. For performers, it feels like disappearance. And here's what makes this complicated. He doesn't need the money. He doesn't need validation. He has both, but he still needs momentum. Momentum is what has defined his adult life since 1971. Tour cycle, album, promotion, repeat, remove momentum, and there's space. And space can be uncomfortable, because silence leaves room for questions. Was it worth the missed time? Was it worth the strain? Did success cost more than it gave? He has 8 children, grandchildren now, a stable marriage to Penny Lancaster. On paper, that looks like balance, but balance achieved late in life still includes chapters written before it. Rod has acknowledged in past interviews that he wasn't always present in his younger years. He says it lightly. No dramatic confession. But there's weight in that acknowledgement. Because as you age, you measure time differently. You don't just count achievements. You count conversations, birthdays, quiet dinners. Success builds monuments. But meaning is built in small rooms. And here's the ache at the center of this chapter. When you've achieved everything publicly, private fulfillment becomes the real scoreboard. And that scoreboard doesn't trend on social media. There's also the generational shift. Younger artists today build careers in 2-year bursts. Rod built one across 6 decades. But that also means watching peers fade, hearing about health struggles in your own circle, attending funerals more often. That changes ambition. Ambition becomes preservation. He once joked that he'd sing until he drops. That line gets applause. But at 81, it also reveals something deeper. He doesn't know how to exist outside performance. And maybe that's not tragic. Maybe it's devotion. But devotion to one identity leaves little room for reinvention beyond it. He has done philanthropy, advocated for cancer awareness, supported charities, but none of those roles replace stage identity. They supplement it. Rod Stewart isn't chasing youth. He's chasing continuation. And continuation becomes fragile when the body sends reminders. So the restlessness isn't greed. It isn't ego. It's inertia. When you've been moving for 60 years, stopping feels unnatural. And in the final chapters of his life, the greatest tension may not be health or headlines. It may be learning how to stand still. But before we conclude, there's one final layer. The question that sits quietly behind all of this. What will be left when the lights finally turn off? There's a moment after every concert. The band leaves. The crew starts wrapping cables. The last few fans linger near the barricades. And then the lights go dark. For most artists, that moment is daily routine. For Rod Stewart, it carries a different weight now. Because at 81, you don't just think about the end of a show. You think about the end of shows. Plural. Rod's career began when Richard Nixon was president, when vinyl was king, when London streets still carried post-war grit. He has outlived entire eras, outlasted bands that were once bigger than him, watched formats die and platforms rise. He has been relevant in the age of radio, MTV, CDs, iTunes, and streaming. That's not luck. That's resilience. But resilience doesn't stop the clock. Eventually, there will be a final tour, a final encore, and no one, not even him, knows when that will be. Here's what makes that thought complicated. Rod Stewart doesn't feel unfinished. His legacy is secure. Knighthood in 2016. Induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice. Millions of fans across continents. He doesn't need one more hit to validate anything. So why does the question of what's next still hover? Because legacy has layers. There's the public legacy, the records, the performances, the highlight reels of Maggie May and Forever Young. Then there's the private legacy, the father, the husband, the friend who survived cancer twice and kept showing up. Public legacy gets archived. Private legacy gets remembered. And the older you get, the more private memory matters. In 2025, when 5 of his children stood behind him at the American Music Awards and surprised him with a Lifetime Achievement Award, it wasn't the trophy that mattered. It was who handed it to him. That moment said something. It said that despite everything, the tours, the headlines, the distance, he built connection that lasted. That's not always the outcome for men who live in the spotlight that long, but here's the quiet tension. When the lights go out permanently, the music will continue. Spotify playlists, vinyl collectors, classic rock radio. But the man won't be in the room anymore. And that awareness changes how you perform in your 80s. You don't take songs lightly. Each version could be someone's last memory of you live. That's pressure of a different kind. Rod doesn't look like someone afraid of death. He looks like someone unwilling to waste time. There's a difference. When illness interrupted his 2025 tour briefly, it wasn't about lost revenue. It was about interrupted rhythm. Because rhythm has structured his life. Album, tour, repeat, remove rhythm. And silence creeps in. And silence asks questions. What parts of me exist without applause? Who am I without motion? That's not a rock star question. That's a human one. We talk about fame like it's oxygen. But oxygen without identity is empty. And identity that depends on oxygen from strangers becomes fragile with age. Rod Stewart has built something enormous. But enormity doesn't guarantee peace. It guarantees remembrance. Peace is built differently. And in our final chapter, we're going to step back from headlines and look at what his story really says. Not about tragedy in the dramatic sense, but about time. We started this story with a dramatic word. Tragedy. At 81, is Rod Stewart living a tragedy? Not in the way tabloids mean it. He didn't fall from grace. He didn't lose everything. He didn't fade into obscurity. He won. That's what makes this more complicated, because sometimes the most uncomfortable stories aren't about collapse. They're about completion. Rod Stewart did everything a boy from Highgate, London could dream of. He turned Maggie May in 1971 into a #1 anthem in both the UK and the US. He stood before millions at Copacabana Beach in 1994. Over 3 million people watching him sing into the night. He was knighted in 2016. He survived thyroid cancer in 2000. He survived prostate cancer diagnosed in 2016. He kept touring into his 80s. That's not tragedy. That's endurance. But here's where the word shifts meaning. The tragedy isn't what he lost. It's what time takes from everyone. No matter how powerful the applause once was, you can sell 120 million records. You can be inducted twice into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You can perform Forever Young in front of your children at the American Music Awards at 80 years old. And still feel the narrowing of years. Not fear. Awareness. Awareness that the stage which gave you everything cannot carry you forever. And that realization is heavier than any bad review. The real tragedy isn't fame. It's impermanence. Rod Stewart represents something rare, a generation that built careers before algorithms, before virality, before 20-second attention spans. He lived through vinyl scratches, cassette rewinds, CD booms, streaming wars. He didn't go viral. He went durable. And durability requires sacrifice. The missed moments, the nights in hotels instead of at home, the marriages that didn't last, the younger version of yourself that can't come back no matter how sharp the suit looks. There is something haunting about watching a legend age in real time. Because legends are supposed to be frozen, immortal. But Sir Rod Stewart is not a statue. He is a man who still feels devastated when he has to cancel shows at 80 because the flu interrupts rhythm. A man who still schedules tours because stillness feels too close to the end. And that's where this story becomes personal. For you, for anyone over 50 watching this. Rod's life is a mirror. We all built identities, careers, roles, reputations. And then, one day, the noise softens. The kids are grown. The phone rings less. The body stiffens a little more in the morning. And we ask the same quiet question. Who am I without the applause? For Rod, applause was literal. For you, maybe it was a job title, a business, a position in your community. Different stage, same psychology. That's why his story resonates deeper than music. Because it's not about whether he should retire. It's about how anyone lets go of something that defined them for decades. Rod hasn't let go yet. Maybe he never fully will. And maybe that's okay. Because perhaps the real victory isn't retiring perfectly. It's refusing to disappear quietly. Rod Stewart didn't chase youth forever. He chased continuation. And continuation, at 81, is brave. So no, his tragedy isn't beyond heartbreaking in the dramatic sense. It's heartbreaking in the human sense. Because even when you win everything, time still wins. If you've watched this far, I want to ask you something honest. If the lights went out tomorrow, in your career, in your role, in your identity, who would you be without it? Share your thoughts below. And if stories like this, real, layered human stories, matter to you, subscribe. Because behind every legend is not just a highlight reel, there's a clock, and we're all hearing it tick.